Imagine a place where the roar of jet engines is a symphony, where precision choreography guides a floating city of steel, and where every movement has purpose. Now imagine being told you don't belong there, dismissed as an outsider in the very place you once called home. What if your quiet return to a world you shaped was met with indifference, only for a single unexpected command to halt an entire fleet, all because of you? This is the story of a legacy that transcends rank, a silenced voice that commands respect, and the profound impact of true leadership, even when it's hidden in plain sight. The Naval War College and quietly studied in classified briefings. But none of that mattered here and now, not to these kids in their crisp uniforms and bright jerseys, not to the young officer who thought she was just a tourist, not to the petty officer who didn't even bother to check the authorization fully before dismissing her. Evelyn kept her composure, even as the whispers and smirks trailed behind her like little stings of salt in the ocean air. She'd endured worse, far worse. The indignities of peacetime were nothing compared to the nights she'd spent awake on a darkened bridge, waiting for radar contacts to resolve, waiting for decisions she alone could make, knowing lives and missions hung in the balance. They could think what they liked. She didn't need their recognition. The helicopter crew chief stood ready at the edge of the landing pad as they approached. A stocky man with weathered hands and watchful eyes, he gave her a quick once-over and reached out to help her into the cabin. His touch was firm, respectful, and didn't linger. At least here was someone who understood what it meant to simply do one's job. She gave him the faintest of nods as she settled into her seat, and he returned it without a word. The rotor wash whipped her hair and tugged at her jacket as the bird lifted off. Below her, the carrier shrank to the size of a toy, the orderly mayhem of the flight deck turning into neat, colored patterns. Out past the carrier's wake stretched the rest of the Pacific Fleet, spread across the endless blue like a steel constellation. Ships in tight formation, destroyers, cruisers, even a Japanese vessel farther out. It was beautiful in its own harsh way. Then the voice came over the radio, crackling, sharp, cutting through the steady thrum of the rotors. Flag to all ships, cease current operations, immediate halt. The entire fleet seemed to go still at once, like a great beast pausing mid-breath. Evelyn glanced back through the open cabin door, and even at this height she could see the change. Jets that had been taxiing froze on the deck. Fuel hoses stopped moving. The great carrier itself seemed to hold still against the sea. The petty officer who'd escorted her stiffened, confusion written plainly across his face as he looked out the window. The young officer, still on the deck below, shaded his eyes and craned upward toward her helicopter as if suddenly realizing what, or rather, who, he had just dismissed. Because on the flagship, Admiral Grant Carter had risen to his feet the instant the comms officer handed him the slip of paper. His expression tightened as he read the name printed there. Then he barked the order to halt all exercises without hesitation, his staff snapping to carry it out. Because he knew. He remembered the woman who once saved his life in a black ocean under hostile skies, whose calm voice and razor-sharp tactics had brought his crippled destroyer out of a kill zone no one else thought they could survive. He remembered even if the rest of these bright young sailors didn't. Evelyn sat back in her seat as the helicopter turned toward the flagship. Her face gave nothing away, but inside a quiet satisfaction bloomed. She didn't need applause or recognition. She didn't even need them to know her name. She only needed one thing, that the fleet she had once given everything to could still move, still fight, still hold the line. And that when it mattered, they still remembered who had taught them how. To them at the Naval War College, she was nothing more than another civilian who had somehow wandered into a restricted zone, someone they needed to escort away. Firmly, but politely, the helicopter sat on the deck ahead of her, its twin rotors beginning to whine and spin as they spooled up, ready to lift her off the ship she had once called her own. Evelyn Blake walked toward it, her hands steady at her sides, though inside she was measuring how much had shifted since her retirement. Everything felt different now, and yet she had the sharp, unmistakable sense that some things were about to shift back. The young officer walking beside her gave a faint, almost impatient shake of his head as they neared the helicopter. "Ma'am, this really isn't a place for tourists," he said, His tone clipped but not unkind. Please follow us. Evelyn offered him no answer. What was there to say? They were just doing their duty, same as she once had. That didn't dull the sting, though. The quiet, cold realization that coming back to a place that had been her home would play out like this. She kept her composure as they guided her closer to the waiting aircraft. Behind her, she could still hear the deck crew, their whispers not meant for her ears, but reaching her all the same. Who is she? Some senator's wife? Probably thought she could get a carrier tour like it's a damn cruise ship. Security's getting soft, letting random civilians up here. Each remark pricked at her like a needle, not because they were cruel or even inaccurate, but because of what they revealed, that she had been entirely erased from the memory of the service she had given her life to. Not even a faint trace of her remained among them now. The helicopter's crew chief stepped forward and offered her a gloved hand as she climbed aboard. His face remained politely impassive, the kind of professional neutrality she had once drilled into her own teams. To him, she was simply another passenger to be moved off his deck and delivered elsewhere. As the engines roared louder and the rotor blades whipped the air into a stinging gale, Evelyn took one last deliberate look back at the flight deck. It was alive with its own steady rhythm of controlled chaos. An FA-18 Hornet was coming in on final approach, and she instinctively focused on the landing signals officer standing at the edge of the deck, reading his body language as he guided the jet in with quiet authority. That subtle stance, the precise motion of the paddles, the way he shifted his weight, all of it so familiar to her, muscle memory and instinct layered over years of observation. She had stood in that very spot countless times, watching recoveries just like this one. The security detail kept their distance now, maintaining a watchful eye until she was actually airborne. They were satisfied. Their mission was complete. The unwanted civilian was being removed. Meanwhile, miles away, on the command bridge of the fleet's flagship, Admiral Grant Carter stood before a glowing wall of screens that displayed his entire task force, 100 ships spread across a vast expanse of Pacific blue. He had been watching the exercise intently, every move and maneuver falling into place like the pieces of a plan he had spent years perfecting. A communications officer stepped up to his side and spoke in a low, efficient tone. Sir, ship security on the Liberty is removing an unauthorized civilian observer. She wasn't on the visitor manifest. Admiral Carter didn't even glance up at first. Handle it through the usual channels, he said, voice brisk. But something in the officer's words clung to him, a faint, inexplicable disquiet. He allowed himself a glance toward the feed showing Liberty's helicopter pad. The image wasn't clear, just a blurry figure walking toward a spinning helicopter. But there was something about the woman's carriage, her bearing, that stopped him cold. Bring that camera in closer, he ordered, his voice suddenly tight. The technician obeyed, zooming in as much as the limited resolution would allow. Even grainy and distorted, the sight made Carter's stomach drop. His breath caught as a jolt of memory surged through him. He knew that face, that quiet confidence, that unmistakable presence. Evelyn Blake, the same Commander Evelyn Blake who had saved his life 8 years earlier, during a mission so classified even now few people dared speak of it. The same tactical genius whose brilliant, unorthodox doctrine had shaped the very exercise his fleet was running in at that exact moment. The officer whose thinking had revolutionized the way the Navy waged maritime war, and whom everyone else seemed to have forgotten. Carter's hand trembled as it hovered over the fleet communications microphone. Then he gripped it hard and pressed the button. His voice, when it came over the net, carried all the iron authority of his rank. Belay that order, he barked. All ships, all stop. Task Force Valor's former commanding officer is aboard the Liberty. I repeat, the commander is aboard. The reaction was immediate, almost electric. Across the entire breadth of the Pacific exercise zone, gray leviathans that had been thundering through whitecaps at flank speed began throttling back. Nuclear reactors were powered down. The foaming wakes behind destroyers and cruisers faded as the fleet came to heel under his command. On the Liberty, the helicopter pilot's fingers froze on the collective, the aircraft still idling on the deck. He heard the Admiral's words through his headset, and the weight of them settled heavily on his shoulders. Something extraordinary, something he didn't yet understand, was unfolding right there before him. And on the deck, sailors who had been casually watching what they thought was the departure of just another civilian suddenly straightened, their eyes sharp with dawning realization. Quiet whispers rippled outward like waves, carrying her name for the first time in years. Conversations on the deck die in an instant. The name Task Force Valor carried weight with every naval professional who heard it, even if they didn't know all the stories behind it. Inside the helicopter, Evelyn listened as the transmission crackled through the aircraft's comm system. A strange mix of pride and embarrassment welled up in her chest. This was not what she'd intended. She'd wanted to visit quietly, to watch the exercise from the sidelines without calling attention to herself. Instead, the entire fleet now knew she was aboard. She glanced at the young security team seated opposite her, the same sailors who had brusquely escorted her off the Liberty's deck only minutes earlier. They now sat stiff and pale, eyes downcast, faces betraying the dawning realization of just who they'd treated like some meddling civilian tourist. The petty officer who had waved away her credentials earlier looked positively ill, his hands gripping his knees as though to keep from shaking. Through the helicopter window, Evelyn could see the vast naval formation slowing down. Dozens of warships stretched across the ocean's expanse, from towering aircraft carriers to sleek dagger-shaped destroyers, all responding to a single command that acknowledged her presence. On Admiral Carter's flagship, a communications officer turned toward him, his voice edged with disbelief. "Sir, all ships report full stop. The entire battle group is holding position." Carter's expression was grim, but his eyes glinted. "Good. Now get me a direct line to the Liberty. Commander Blake is coming back aboard." And this time, he allowed the faintest hint of a smile to crease his features. "She'll get the welcome she deserved from the start." Across hundreds of square miles of open Pacific, the most powerful naval force ever assembled drifted to a standstill, not because of an enemy threat or a mechanical fault or a storm, but because one name had been spoken aloud by someone who understood the weight it carried. Tens of thousands of tons of steel lay quiet on the water. Even the roar of the ocean seemed to hush around them, as though it too could feel the gravity of that name. What could bring an entire fleet to its knees? A hurricane? A direct order from the president? Or the sudden appearance of a living legend? For those who could feel it, the silence spoke louder than cannon fire. Within minutes of Admiral Carter's fleet-wide transmission, secure communication circuits throughout Pacific Command lit up with urgent chatter. In Pearl Harbor, in the command center of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Patricia Hayes was halfway through her morning coffee when her aide entered briskly, headset pressed to one ear. "Ma'am, we have a Valor designation activation in the exercise zone. Admiral Carter has ordered a full fleet stop." Hayes set her coffee down slowly, her expression sharpening as she turned to her secure terminal and began pulling up classified files. "Confirm the identity," she said. "Who exactly are we talking about?" Her aide's voice was steady, but she didn't miss the flicker of awe in it. "Commander Evelyn Blake, ma'am, former commanding officer of Task Force Valor. She's been identified aboard the USS Liberty." Hayes let out a low whistle through her teeth. Memories of her own junior officer days flashed through her mind. Briefings and after-action reports. Stories of a commander whose brilliance on the water left even her superiors scrambling to keep up. "Understood," she said at last. "Tell Admiral Carter he has full authority to handle this as he sees fit. And Captain," she added, her tone suddenly hard, "make sure this stays inside the proper channels. No leaks." Back aboard the flagship, Carter was already making preparations for Evelyn's return to the Liberty. But first, he needed his own staff to understand just who they were about to welcome. "Pull up the Task Force Valor files," he ordered his intelligence officer. Everything were cleared to see. On the main display, screen after screen of classified records scrolled into view, mission reports, battle assessments, tactical schematics. Even through heavy black redactions, the sheer scale of Blake's impact was overwhelming. The operations officer, standing off to Carter's side, murmured almost to himself, "Sir, I had no idea. The Malacca Strait operation, the South China Sea incident. She was the one behind all of that." Carter's nod was sharp, decisive. Commander Blake didn't just lead Task Force Valor. She redefined the way this Navy thinks about special operations. Half the tactics you're using in this very exercise came straight from her playbook. Meanwhile, the helicopter carrying Evelyn sped back toward the USS Liberty. Out the window, she watched the mighty formation of ships waiting silently on the glassy sea, gray steel hulls gleaming under the morning sun. Every one of them stilled in her honor. The vast formation of the fleet stretched endlessly across the horizon, a staggering array of warships sitting silent and still in perfect alignment at Admiral Carter's command. Dozens of hulls glinted in the sun, each one a testament to discipline, precision, and power. Evelyn Blake stood in the helicopter, watching it all unfold below her, humbled by the sheer magnitude of it. It was overwhelming to see so many vessels, and to know they had stopped for her. She had left the Navy quietly, almost anonymously, avoiding any fanfare, declining ceremonial positions and honors. She had never wanted her career to become a spectacle. Her service, she believed, should speak for itself. But now, here she was, and an entire fleet lay dead in the water simply because she was here. The pilot's calm voice crackled in her headset, cutting through her thoughts. "Ma'am, I've been ordered to take you directly to the flagship. Admiral Carter requests your presence immediately." Her eyes fluttered shut for a moment as his name sank in. Grant Carter. She could still picture him years ago. A young lieutenant commander, brilliant and daring, but prone to impulses that could have gotten him killed. She remembered the day during Operation Pacific Shield when his destroyer had been trapped, outnumbered, and hopelessly outgunned by an overwhelming hostile force. She herself had been commanding Task Force Valor from a nearby position. Against every shred of conventional wisdom, she had ordered her units into an intricate deception maneuver. Through her audacious plan, she'd made Carter's lone destroyer appear to be part of a much larger coordinated fleet. The enemy, unwilling to risk engaging what they believed was superior strength, had withdrawn. Carter had gone home that night to his wife and children. Her role in that mission, however, had remained classified. Now, as the helicopter dipped toward the flagship's deck, she could see him waiting there. Grant Carter, no longer the young hotshot but an admiral, standing at full attention surrounded by his senior staff, all immaculately turned out in the dress uniforms despite the operational setting. The moment the helicopter touched down, Carter strode forward himself and reached up to assist her as she disembarked. Her boots met the deck. He straightened, saluted crisply, and his voice carried just enough warmth to soften the formality. "Welcome aboard, Commander. It's an honor to have you in my area of operations." Evelyn returned his salute, feeling the old weight of history and protocol settling over her like a familiar cloak. "Admiral Carter," she replied, her voice even, though her eyes softened just a little. "I see you've done well for yourself." His expression flickered with something between gratitude and pride. "Ma'am, everything I've accomplished has been built on the foundation you laid. The tactics we're using here today, the way we conduct operations, all of it traces back to your principles." He swept his hand toward the horizon where the fleet stood poised and silent, like an immense chessboard waiting for her move. "This exercise is designed to test scenarios you created. The doctrine my captains follow was born from your innovations. You're not just visiting this fleet, Commander. You're witnessing your legacy in motion." With quiet dignity, he guided her into the bridge, where his senior officers awaited. Their faces showed the mix of deep respect and keen curiosity reserved for legends, because that's what she was to them, even if they hadn't been privy to the classified details. On the bridge, Carter turned to his assembled staff, and his voice took on the tone of a man proud to present a master to her students. "Gentlemen, Commander Blake pioneered the integrated special operations doctrine that's now standard practice. The multi-platform coordination protocols you've all drilled into muscle memory. The deception tactics that saved my ship 8 years ago. Those all came from her mind." An operations officer stepped forward then, his question hesitant but eager. "Ma'am, if I may, the Strait of Hormuz scenario they teach at the War College, the one where a single task force neutralized a threat that normally would have required an entire carrier group. That was you, wasn't it?" Before she could answer, Carter gave him a knowing look and finished the thought himself. Evelyn's response was measured, her lips curving into the faintest trace of a wry smile. "Classification limits what I can say about specific operations," she said, her voice calm but edged with the authority of someone who knew more than she could ever reveal. But I will say this, the most effective operations are often those that avoid direct confrontation entirely. There's an art to letting your enemy defeat himself. At that, the intelligence officer spoke up softly, as if repeating a lesson from memory. We study that principle. We talk about it in lectures. But to see it actually implemented, the operations officer finished the thought for him, awe in his tone. That's why the fleet stopped when Admiral Carter spoke your name. Carter then led her out to the observation deck, where the full sweep of the exercise was visible. The ocean sparkled, steel gray ships stretching into infinity, each waiting, silent, expectant. His voice was quiet, almost reverent, as he stood beside her. Commander, I want you to know, every officer in this fleet has benefited from what you created. Your tactical thinking has saved lives, averted conflicts, and kept these waters secure in ways most of them will never fully understand. And so she stood there for a long moment, saying nothing, watching the ships she'd once only imagined now come alive, a silent armada carrying her name in every maneuver. The quiet influence of her work that may never be written about in any public history, but which shaped the balance of power all the same. On the observation deck, Evelyn stood beside Grant Carter, gazing out at the sea as the Pacific shimmered under the afternoon sun. Below them, an entire fleet stretched to the horizon, destroyers cutting clean lines through the water, cruisers and submarines maneuvering in silent coordination, supply ships weaving through to keep the whole force sustained. It was a breathtaking spectacle of naval precision, decades in the making, and Evelyn couldn't help but feel a pang of pride. "You've built something extraordinary here, Grant," she said at last, her voice even, but carrying more emotion than she intended. He turned toward her, the faintest smile tugging at his otherwise formal demeanor. "We've just continued building what you started, ma'am," he replied. "Task Force Valor may no longer officially exist, but its spirit lives on in everything we do." Then, straightening, he faced her more directly, his tone shifting to something more formal but still personal. "Ma'am, I have a request. Would you consider observing the final phase of this exercise? My commanders would benefit enormously from your insight." Evelyn let her eyes wander back over the formation before them. Down on the decks of those sleek ships, young officers and sailors, most barely old enough to know her name, were executing maneuvers that grew out of concepts she had tested long ago in operations they would never be cleared to hear about. She thought about those fresh, determined faces carrying forward what she had built. "I'd be honored to observe," she answered quietly, then added with a faint but unmistakable edge of humor, "but on one condition." "Name it, ma'am." "No more stopping the fleet on my account. These sailors have work to do." That drew a rare, genuine smile from Carter. "Understood, Commander. Fleet operations resume immediately." Moments later, signals flashed across the formation, and the ships began moving again in a seamless, coordinated ballet. Evelyn remained by the railing, watching them fall back into rhythm, reflecting on a truth that had taken her years to learn. The greatest honor didn't always come from medals or citations or speeches in grand halls. Sometimes it was enough simply to see your life's work carried on by those who understood its worth. For the rest of the afternoon, she observed from the flagship's command center, quietly watching as Carter's fleet executed a series of increasingly complex maneuvers. She recognized each variation on the tactics as evolutions of the principles she had once pioneered. During a break in her operations, Carter approached her once more, this time with a request that caught her off guard. "Commander," he began carefully, "would you consider addressing my senior staff? Many of these officers have studied your tactics without ever knowing their origin. I think they deserve to hear it from the architect herself." An hour later, she stood at the front of the flagship's wardroom. Before her sat 24 senior officers from across the fleet, battle-tested commanders with the weight of whole crews on their shoulders. These were not the young sailors who had dismissed her earlier as a curious bystander. These men and women knew exactly who she was and what her ideas had meant for the Navy. She let her eyes sweep the room before she began. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had fought and earned every ounce of it, "warfare has evolved, but the fundamentals remain constant. You don't win because you're stronger or faster. You win because you're smarter, and more adaptable than your adversary. From the back of the room, a destroyer captain raised his hand. "Ma'am," he said, "the integrated operations doctrine we use today, how did you see that working when you first envisioned it?" She nodded thoughtfully. "Captain, the key insight was that modern naval warfare isn't about what one ship can do. It's about what all of them can do together. Information sharing, coordinated response, making your enemy fight a dozen different battles while you fight only one." She gestured toward the tactical display lighting up the walls around them. "Every sensor you have is just one part of a bigger picture. Every weapon system is a tool for any commander who needs it. You stop thinking of each ship as a weapon. The entire formation becomes the weapon." Across the room, she noticed the operations officer from the USS Liberty, the same officer who had stood stiffly by while security had escorted her off the deck earlier. He raised his hand and spoke hesitantly, clearly trying to find the right words. "Ma'am, I was aboard the Liberty earlier today when you were properly escorted off a restricted area by personnel who were just doing their jobs." He flushed slightly, glancing down before continuing. "I just wanted to say, I apologize if—" Evelyn cut him off gently with a faint smile. "No apology necessary, Commander. Security protocols exist for good reasons. You did exactly what you were supposed to do." Relief was written plainly across his face. "Thank you, ma'am, but if I may, what experiences shaped these innovations? How did you develop them?" Evelyn fell silent for a long beat, her gaze dropping for the first time. Then she looked back up, her eyes steady. "Commander," she said evenly, "the best tactical innovations come from being in impossible situations and refusing to accept that they're impossible. When the conventional options all fail, you either adapt or you lose." From the side of the room, Carter rose to his feet. "If I might add something," he said, addressing the assembled officers, "Commander Blake's work didn't just change how we fight. It changed how we think, about deterrence, about presence, about preventing conflicts before they even start. There are more crises that never happened than anyone will ever know thanks to her work." Evelyn didn't reply right away. Instead, she let her eyes wander once more to the glowing displays on the walls, the quiet hum of the command center around her, the sharp, attentive faces of the officers who carried on her legacy. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel, not pride exactly, but something quieter and just as enduring. A cruiser captain raised his hand during the lecture and asked, his tone both respectful and urgent, "Ma'am, what advice would you give to officers who want to innovate but feel constrained by existing doctrine?" Evelyn stood a little straighter and let her gaze sweep the room, filled with eager, watchful faces. "Study the doctrine," she began, her voice firm but patient, "until you understand why it exists. Don't just memorize it. Understand the logic, the history, the assumptions behind it. Then look closer at those assumptions, because they always change. And when they do, the doctrine must evolve to meet reality." She paused there, letting the weight of her words settle over the group. The young officers were leaning forward in their seats now, hanging on every syllable. Evelyn's expression softened slightly, almost a wry smile tugging at her lips. But don't mistake being unconventional for being effective. Innovation without discipline, it was chaos. The goal isn't simply to be different from what came before. The goal is to be better. The session wrapped up soon after, but several officers stayed behind to speak with her one-on-one. She welcomed each of them with quiet grace, though one conversation in particular stayed with her. A young lieutenant commander approached her, a mix of curiosity and doubt in his eyes. "Ma'am," he asked carefully, "will innovations like yours still matter as warfare becomes more automated?" Evelyn smiled, not indulgently, but with a kind of quiet certainty. "Lieutenant Commander," she replied, "technology amplifies human decision-making, but it will never replace it. The most sophisticated computer in the world can tell you what's happening and what's possible, but only humans can decide what should happen." That evening, Admiral Carter hosted a small dinner in her honor. The gathering was formal but far from stiff, a circle of seasoned professionals who understood the demands of service and the weight of sacrifice. During his toast, Carter turned his glass toward her. "Your innovations gave us tools, Evelyn," he said warmly, "but more importantly, you gave us a way of thinking, one that adapts to new challenges." That's a legacy that will outlast any single piece of hardware or any single platform. Later, as the evening wound down, Evelyn stepped outside onto the deck of the flagship. The sea stretched out around her, black and endless, the ships of the exercise formations scattered across the horizon, their running lights glittering like distant stars. Tomorrow, these vessels would sail back to their home ports. The crews would return to their training routines, maintenance schedules, and day-to-day operations. And yet, she knew they would carry with them ideas, principles, and innovations that had begun years ago in classified operations most of them would never even know about. She didn't need her name carved into history books. She didn't crave public recognition or ceremonial honors. Seeing her life's work live on in the hands of capable officers, that was all the honor she would ever need. 3 months later, an unexpected letter arrived, an invitation from the Naval War College asking her to return as a guest lecturer for their Advanced Strategic Studies program. She accepted. Standing once again before a classroom, this time filled with senior officers from navies around the world, she listened as a Royal Navy captain asked a question that struck at the very heart of her career. "Commander Blake," he began, his accent clipped but polite, "what's the difference between command authority and true leadership?" Evelyn walked slowly to the wide window at the side of the room, where the waters of Narragansett Bay shimmered in the morning light, stretching toward the horizon. Out there, unseen but very much alive, fleets were training, ships were sailing, sailors were serving. Without turning back yet, she spoke. "Command authority," she said, her voice quiet but firm enough to carry to the corners of the room, "comes from rank, from position, from the institution that grants you power over others. True leadership, though, that comes from earning the respect of people who choose to follow you even when they don't have to." The room went completely silent. After a moment, she turned back to face them, her expression as composed as ever. "3 months ago," she continued, "I was escorted off a carrier deck as an unwanted civilian. The sailors who removed me were doing their jobs, following orders, respecting an authority, and they did it correctly. But when Admiral Carter spoke my name, an entire fleet stopped. Not because they were ordered to, but because they knew what that name meant. They chose to listen." Her gaze swept the room once more, and her tone deepened as she delivered the heart of her answer. True leadership isn't about the commands you give in the moment. It's about the principles you establish, the example you set, that guide decisions long after you're gone. It's about building something larger than yourself, something that continues to serve even when you're no longer there to lead it. A Japanese destroyer captain raised his hand from the back row. "Ma'am," he asked earnestly, "how do we know if our leadership will endure beyond our service?" Evelyn gave him a small, knowing smile. "You'll know," she said simply, "when officers you've never met are solving problems with the principles you taught, using innovations you developed, and striving for excellence because of the standards you set. That's how you know you led well, because your leadership lives on. The kind of leadership that truly endures is the kind that teaches others how to lead." Evelyn's hand rose gently, fingers pointing toward the Naval Academy across the bay, its white buildings gleaming faintly in the afternoon light. "Every officer in this room," she said, "will one day take off their uniform for the last time. Every ship you now command will one day be decommissioned. The weight of your command will pass into other hands. And in time, your names will fade from memory, even among those who serve. But if you have led well, if you have led with integrity, with courage, your influence won't end. It will live on in the decisions of those who learn from you, in ways you'll never see, but that will outlast you nonetheless." When the session wrapped and the room began to empty, a young American lieutenant commander approached her quietly. His posture was formal, but his eyes carried a kind of earnestness she couldn't help but notice. "Ma'am," he began, with a hint of pride in his voice, "I served aboard the USS Liberty during the exercise where we first met you. I thought you'd want to know. Your story has become part of our ship's culture. Whenever new sailors come aboard, we tell them about the day our fleet stopped in its tracks for a legend we didn't even recognize at first." Evelyn's lips curved into a warm, knowing smile. She tilted her head just slightly, studying him as she asked, "And what lesson do they take from that story?" He straightened a little more, his answer ready, as though he'd thought about it many times before. That respect, he said firmly, isn't about rank or ribbons or a uniform. It's about what you've done for others and how you've served something bigger than yourself. That evening, long after the sun had begun to sink behind the horizon, Evelyn found herself walking alone along the quiet waterfront, where countless generations of naval officers had once marched, trained, and stood watch. The salty breeze carried with it the faint tang of the sea, the faint murmur of waves washing against the piers. Before her stretched the endless ocean, dark, vast, and alive, bearing ships and sailors whose stories would never be known, though their sacrifices had shaped the world all the same. Her thoughts wandered to the young security team that had once escorted her off the Liberty, doing their duty with an almost awkward kind of professionalism. To Admiral Grant Carter, who had gone on to carry forward the very innovations that years ago had saved his life, innovations she herself had designed. To all the officers she would never know, men and women she would never meet, quietly applying principles she had developed long ago in operations that would remain classified forever. She stopped at the edge of the water, watching the faint outlines of ships far out at sea. The ocean, she thought, remembers everything. Every sacrifice made quietly and without fanfare. Every innovation born out of necessity and carried forward by others. Every single moment when someone chose service over self. Some legacies, she knew, were carved into stone, names on plaques and memorials. But others lived on here in the water itself, carried from one generation to the next, flowing invisibly through time. Out on the open sea, rank might change. Uniforms might one day come off and be folded away. But legends, they never sink. They simply sail into the horizon, carried by those who understand their worth and who refuse to let them be forgotten.